March 5, 1929. A man sits in a Detroit trade school classroom, 74 years old, teaching plumbing to boys who will never know his name. David Dunbar Buick invented the overhead valve engine that powered millions of cars. He founded the company that became the cornerstone of General Motors. By 1908, the year GM was born, Buick was outselling Ford and Cadillac combined. Now he can't afford a telephone. He dies this day of colon cancer, owning nothing, having sold his stock for pennies decades before. The shares he let go would be worth tens of millions. Was this capitalism working, or capitalism devouring its creator? The man who invented the engine that changed America died broke. The factory that bore his name would run for another 70 years without him, and the city built around that factory would eventually poison its own children with the chemicals left behind when the money moved on. This is the story of Buick City. Flint, Michigan sits 70 miles north of Detroit on the Flint River. For most of the 20th century, it was Vehicle City, the birthplace of General Motors and the muscle behind America's automotive dominance. At its center stood Buick City, a 413-acre manufacturing complex that at one point employed 30,000 workers building cars that defined middle-class aspiration. The complex stretched from Hamilton Avenue to Leith Street, a dense grid of brick buildings connected by elevated bridges and internal rail lines. Furnaces ran continuously. 300-ton presses stamped metal. Robots with vision systems installed glass. Assembly lines moved at 74 cars per hour. The heat was constant, the noise relentless, the danger real. David Dunbar Buick was born in Arbroath, Scotland, on September 17, 1854. His family emigrated when he was 2, settling in Detroit. He quit school at 15 to work for a plumbing company. By 1882, he and a partner bought that company. Buick showed immediate talent for invention, creating a lawn sprinkler and, more importantly, a method for bonding porcelain enamel to cast iron, making white bathtubs affordable. The plumbing business prospered. Then Buick became obsessed with gasoline engines. In 1899, he sold his share of the plumbing company for $100,000 and founded the Buick Autovim and Power Company to build engines. He intended to supply other manufacturers. Instead, he spent everything developing a complete car. By 1902, he had built one vehicle and consumed all his capital. The company was bankrupt. He reformed as Buick Manufacturing Company in 1902, still focused more on engineering than business. By year's end, another bankruptcy. But Buick had created something revolutionary: the valve-in-head overhead valve engine. Every side valve engine of the era was instantly obsolete. The design Buick invented in his desperate workshop became the standard for the entire automotive industry and remains in use today. James Whiting, owner of Flint Wagon Works, saw potential in the bankrupt company and its revolutionary engine. He bought Buick in 1903 and moved the operation to Flint, integrating it into his carriage factory at Hamilton Avenue and St. John Street. In 1904, Buick built 37 cars. The company still lost money. Whiting needed more than an inventor. He needed a businessman. William Crapo Durant was born December 8, 1861, in Boston. His grandfather was a Michigan governor. His father abandoned the family in 1869. Durant grew up in Flint, dropped out of high school, and at age 25 bought the manufacturing rights to a 2-wheeled road cart for $1,500 borrowed money. He convinced J. Dallas Dort to partner with him. Within 15 years, Durant Dort Carriage Company was the largest vehicle manufacturer in the United States, worth $2 million. Durant was a millionaire at 40, bored, and looking for the next challenge. Whiting convinced him to take over Buick on November 1, 1904. Durant was skeptical of automobiles. He thought they smelled bad and were dangerous. He wouldn't let his daughter ride in one, but he understood manufacturing systems and dealer networks. Within 4 years, Durant transformed Buick from a failing machine shop into America's best-selling automobile brand. The scale of the transformation was extraordinary. Buick produced 37 cars in 1904. In 1908, it produced 8,820, outselling Ford and Cadillac combined. By 1910, production reached 30,000. Durant achieved this by applying carriage industry methods to automobile manufacturing, vertical integration, dealer franchises, model differentiation, and aggressive marketing. He understood that different buyers wanted different products at different prices. Henry Ford offered one car in one color. Durant offered variety. The Buick factory in Flint expanded rapidly to accommodate demand. Buildings were added continuously. The workforce grew from hundreds to thousands. Durant established dealerships across the country, using the same distribution model he had perfected with carriages. He advertised aggressively. He entered Buick race cars in competitions to prove performance and reliability. In 1908, A Buick driven by Louis Chevrolet won multiple races, establishing the brand's reputation for power and durability. Durant's vision extended beyond simply building cars. He recognized that automobiles would require an entire ecosystem of support industries: parts manufacturers, tire companies, electrical suppliers, bodybuilders. Controlling that ecosystem would give GM competitive advantages in cost, quality, and innovation. This understanding drove his acquisition strategy for General Motors. The formation of GM itself was almost accidental. J.P. Morgan proposed consolidating the largest automakers into a single company to stabilize the chaotic industry. Morgan invited Durant, Henry Ford, Ransom Olds, and Ben Briscoe to negotiate. Ford demanded cash instead of stock and walked away. The talks collapsed, but Durant remained convinced consolidation was necessary. He traveled to Lansing by train in the middle of the night, woke up Ransom Olds, and proposed a merger. Olds agreed. General Motors was incorporated September 16, 1908, with Buick and Oldsmobile as the founding divisions. The $2,000 incorporation fee would become one of the greatest bargains in industrial history. Within a year, Durant tried to acquire Ford for $8 million. Henry Ford agreed to sell. The banking committee reviewing the loan turned it down. Had they approved it, Ford Motor Company would have become a division of General Motors, and automotive history would have been completely different. Between 1908 and 1910, Durant acquired Cadillac, Oakland, several parts suppliers, and numerous smaller companies. Some purchases were strategic, others were speculative, based on patents or technologies that might become valuable. Not all succeeded. Some drained capital without producing returns. By 1910, sales declined due to competition from Ford's Model T, which was cheaper and more reliable than many of GM's offerings. GM's board, dominated by banking interests that had provided expansion capital, lost confidence in Durant's management. They forced him out in September 1910, citing reckless spending and insufficient financial controls. Durant was undeterred. In 1911, he partnered with race car driver Louis Chevrolet to build a new company. Durant wanted affordable mass-market cars. Chevrolet wanted high-performance vehicles for enthusiasts. The company launched with Chevrolet's preferences: expensive, powerful cars. They sold poorly. Durant eventually bought out Chevrolet's interest in the company, keeping the name because it sounded good. The company then pivoted to affordable models that competed directly with Ford. By 1914, Chevrolet was selling well enough that Durant used it as a vehicle to regain control of GM. He offered GM shareholders the option to trade their shares for Chevrolet shares at favorable ratios. Enough shareholders accepted that by 1916, Chevrolet effectively controlled GM. Durant walked into a GM board meeting and announced that Chevrolet now held majority interest. He was elected president again, 6 years after being forced out. His second tenure was more successful than the first in terms of growth, but equally problematic in terms of financial management. He brought Chevrolet into GM, creating a low-price brand that could compete with Ford. He acquired Fisher Body, securing GM's supply of automotive bodies. He bought Frigidaire, diversifying into appliances. The corporation grew dramatically. By 1920, GM was 8 times larger than it had been under the banker's management, but Durant again overextended. He believed in GM's future so completely that he bought stock on margin to support the price. When the post-World War I recession hit in 1920, stock values collapsed. Durant had borrowed millions to buy GM shares, betting the price would continue rising. Instead, it fell. In 6 months, he lost $90 million. Much of it borrowed money. The DuPont family and J.P. Morgan interests bailed him out, but the price was his resignation. For the second time, Durant lost control of the company he founded. This time, the loss was permanent. Durant was 59 years old. Instead of retiring, he immediately started Durant Motors in 1921, attempting to compete with GM and Ford. The company produced the Durant 4 and the Durant 6, competent vehicles priced between Chevrolet and Buick, but the market was saturated. Ford and GM dominated. Durant Motors never gained traction. By 1930, it was bankrupt. Durant then attempted investments in other industries: oil ventures in California, real estate in Florida, carburetor manufacturing. All failed. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out much of his remaining wealth. The bowling alley was his final venture. In 1940, at age 78, Durant opened the North Flint Recreation Center across the street from Buick City. It was located in an old trucking depot that everyone said was unsuitable for conversion. Durant said bowling would be family-friendly without beer, focused on recreation rather than gambling. He built the Horseshoe Inn, one of America's first drive-in restaurants, attached to the bowling alley. He envisioned a national chain of similar facilities. A stroke in 1942 ended his plans. Durant spent the final 5 years of his life diminished, physically weakened, financially dependent on friends and former colleagues. William Durant died March 18, 1947, in New York City, penniless. The Chrysler family and GM CEO Alfred Sloan paid his debts. He was 85 years old. David Buick had preceded him by 18 years, dying March 5, 1929, in similar circumstances. Buick taught plumbing in a Detroit trade school, 74 years old, unable to afford a telephone. He died of colon cancer, owning nothing, having sold his stock for pennies decades before. The shares he let go would be worth tens of millions. Both men built empires and watched others profit from their vision. Both were inventors and dreamers, terrible at managing money, brilliant at seeing futures that hadn't yet arrived. But the factory they built kept running. Flint, Michigan sits 70 miles north of Detroit on the Flint River. For most of the 20th century, it was Vehicle City, the birthplace of General Motors, and the muscle behind America's automotive dominance. At its center stood Buick City, a 413-acre manufacturing complex that at one point employed 30,000 workers building cars that defined middle-class aspiration. The complex stretched from Hamilton Avenue to Leith Street, a dense grid of brick buildings connected by elevated bridges and internal rail lines. Furnaces ran continuously. 300-ton presses stamped metal. Robots with vision systems installed glass. Assembly lines moved at 74 cars per hour. By 1950, Buick was producing 550,000 vehicles annually. By 1955, production reached 745,000. The Flint complex employed 30,000 workers in the 1950s at peak capacity. The factory produced everything in-house: wheel bearings, nuts, bolts, screws, transmissions, suspension components, wheels, interiors. 24 separate buildings connected by internal logistics networks. Raw steel entered on one side. Finished cars exited on the other. The workers who built these cars were part of a highly structured system. Shifts ran around the clock. First shift started at 6 a.m., second shift at 2 p.m., third shift at 10 p.m. Each shift had its own culture, its own rhythms. First shift workers were typically older, more senior, with families and mortgages. Second shift skewed younger, workers balancing factory jobs with second jobs or school. Third shift was the hardest, disrupting sleep patterns, paying a small premium for the inconvenience. The work itself was physically demanding and repetitive. Assembly line workers performed the same task hundreds of times per shift. Install a door panel, tighten 4 bolts, move to the next car. The line moved continuously. Falling behind meant the next worker had to compensate, creating cascading delays. The factory was loud. Stamping presses operated continuously, 300 tons of force shaping metal with percussive impacts that echoed through buildings. Welding sparked, paint booths hissed. Workers wore earplugs, but hearing loss was common after decades of exposure. The heat was oppressive in summer. The factory had minimal air conditioning. Stamping and welding operations generated intense heat. Workers drank water constantly, took salt tablets to prevent heat exhaustion. In winter, the factory was drafty and uneven, hot near furnaces, cold near loading docks. Injuries were common: cuts from sharp metal, burns from welding, crushed fingers from presses, back injuries from lifting. The factory had a medical clinic on site. Serious injuries went to Hurley Medical Center in Flint, but the wages were good. In the 1950s and 1960s, auto workers in Flint earned middle-class incomes. They bought houses in neighborhoods near the plant: Civic Park, the North End, the East Side. These were working-class neighborhoods where home ownership was attainable. A single income could support a family. Wives could stay home or work part-time. Kids went to public schools that were well-funded by property taxes from GM facilities and worker housing. The union provided additional security. The UAW had been born in Flint in 1936. During the sit-down strike at Fisher Body Plant No. 1, workers occupied the factory for 44 days, refusing to leave until GM recognized the union. Police attempted to evict them violently. The workers fought back. Ultimately, GM capitulated. The UAW was recognized, and workers gained collective bargaining rights. From that foundation, the UAW negotiated strong contracts. By the 1950s, Buick workers had health insurance, pensions, paid vacations, grievance procedures, and job protections. Seniority determined layoffs and recalls. Workers couldn't be fired without cause and due process. Negotiations occurred every 3 years, often contentious, sometimes resulting in strikes, but the overall trajectory was upward. Each contract improved wages and benefits. The culture around the factory was distinct. Bars near the plant filled at shift changes, workers stopping for beer before heading home. Bowling leagues were organized by union locals. Company softball teams competed in summer leagues. Christmas parties, picnics, and charity events brought workers and families together. The factory wasn't just a workplace. It was the center of social life for entire neighborhoods. Generational continuity was common. Fathers brought sons into the plant. Uncles got nephews hired. Brothers worked side by side. Families accumulated decades of combined seniority. Retirement parties celebrated 30 or 40 years of service. The company gave watches, plaques, recognition. Workers bought cottages in northern Michigan for summer vacations, often in clusters near other Buick families. During World War II, Buick production shifted to military equipment. The factory built M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, the fastest armored vehicle of the war. From 1942 to 1946, no civilian cars were produced. When production resumed, Buick introduced innovations like the Dynaflow automatic transmission in 1948 and high-compression V8 engines in 1953. The toothy vertical pillar grille became iconic. Hardtop convertible styling appeared on the 1949 Roadmaster Riviera. Buick represented American prosperity and engineering confidence. Flint's population peaked at 196,040 in 1960. The city ranked as the 62nd largest in the United States. GM employed 77,000 workers in the Flint area in 1978. The factory ran 3 shifts. Parking lots stretched for blocks. The noise from stamping presses could be heard a mile away. Neighborhoods surrounded the complex, built for workers who walked to the plant. But by the late 1960s, cracks were appearing. White flight accelerated after the urban riots of 1967. Flint's first black mayor, Floyd McCree, resigned in protest in 1968 when the city commission refused to adopt an ordinance banning housing discrimination. Racial segregation was pronounced. As wealthier residents moved to suburbs, the city's tax base eroded. Infrastructure began to decay. Japanese manufacturers were building better cars for less money. The 1973 oil crisis proved Americans would buy small, fuel-efficient imports over large domestic sedans. GM's market share began a long, slow decline. From 40% in 1980, it would drop to 30.7% by 1997. GM had built 8 new plants in Genesee County between 1947 and 1960, but all were outside the city limits. The company was deliberately moving production to suburban locations with newer infrastructure, lower taxes, and less unionized workforces. The 1973 model year was Buick's best ever, with 821,165 cars sold. Then, the oil embargo hit. Arab oil-producing nations imposed an embargo in October 1973 in response to U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Gasoline prices quadrupled. Shortages led to rationing and long lines at gas stations. Americans suddenly cared about fuel efficiency. Small, economical Japanese and European cars became attractive. Large American sedans like Buicks became liabilities. Sales plummeted. GM responded by downsizing vehicles. The full-size Buick LeSabre and Electra were redesigned smaller and lighter for 1977, losing more than a foot in length and hundreds of pounds in weight. The changes improved fuel economy, but reduced interior space and comfort. Traditional Buick buyers felt betrayed. Younger buyers preferred imports. The second oil crisis in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, reinforced the trend. Fuel efficiency became the dominant consumer priority. Japanese manufacturers offered cars that got 30 or 40 miles per gallon. American manufacturers struggled to achieve 20. Buick's reputation suffered. In the 1950s and 1960s, Buick had been synonymous with quality and prestige. By the early 1980s, it was synonymous with outdated engineering and poor quality control. J.D. Power surveys consistently ranked Japanese brands higher than American brands. Consumer Reports recommended imports over domestics. By the early 1980s, GM was in crisis. Japanese automakers were dominating quality surveys. Toyota's production methods were more efficient. Honda and Nissan were capturing market share. GM's response was to close old factories and attempt to modernize the survivors. In 1982, Buick executives proposed a radical renovation. Instead of closing the Flint complex, they would transform it into GM's answer to Toyota City, using Japanese just-in-time manufacturing methods, labor management cooperation, advanced robotics, and strict inventory control. The plan required $350 million in investment. GM approved it. In September 1985, after 3 years of construction and reorganization, the complex was officially renamed Buick City. The new facility was designed to build front-wheel drive LeSabres using cutting-edge technology. More than 200 robots assisted workers with unloading parts, installing glass, and painting cars. Computers and vision systems guided precision work. The stamping operation followed tight schedules, delivering parts to assembly lines just as needed rather than storing massive inventories. The workforce was reorganized into 210 teams, manning 800 workstations across 2 shifts. Workers were paid for knowledge, not seniority, and encouraged to learn every job on their team. Production of the new front-wheel drive LeSabre began September 23, 1985. It was a disaster. During the first 3 months, the assembly line averaged only 10 cars per hour, 64 fewer than capacity. The target was 74 cars per hour. Actual production was less than half that. Quality was abysmal. The 1986 LeSabre ranked near the bottom in corporate surveys. Body panels didn't align properly. Paint finishes were inconsistent. Electrical systems failed. Transmissions leaked. Warranty claims surged. Workers speculated the plant would close within the year. Morale collapsed. The technology was too new, implemented too quickly. Robots malfunctioned. Just-in-time delivery meant any supplier problem stopped the entire line. Team structures created confusion about authority and responsibility. Management responded with the old methods: shouting, blaming, threatening. The factory was dysfunctional, producing bad cars slowly. The turning point came in April 1987 when production dropped from 2 shifts to 1. GM had lost confidence. Orders were reduced. Half the workforce was laid off temporarily. With only 1 shift operating and pressure reduced, something changed. Management and workers, facing the real possibility of permanent closure, stopped fighting and started solving problems. Frank Mass, a team leader who had worked at Buick for 20 years, described the shift. The old way of shouting and finger-pointing and throwing things and threatening became history. We decided not to operate Buick City that way anymore. Workers and managers formed problem-solving teams. They studied the NUMMI joint venture between GM and Toyota in California, where Japanese manufacturing methods had been successfully implemented with American workers. NUMMI's approach was fundamentally different from traditional American automotive manufacturing. Problems were treated as opportunities for learning rather than occasions for blame. Workers were given authority to stop the line if they identified defects, rather than letting bad parts proceed. Teams met daily to discuss issues and develop solutions. Supervisors acted as coaches rather than enforcers. Buick City adopted these principles gradually. The 2,650 remaining employees reorganized into 210 teams of approximately 12 workers each. Teams elected leaders from within their ranks. Team members were trained to perform every job in their area, rotating positions to develop versatility and prevent repetitive strain. Pay was based on skills acquired, not seniority, incentivizing continuous learning. The results were not immediate. Cultural change required time. Workers who had spent decades in an adversarial system didn't automatically trust that management's promises were genuine. But incrementally, the transformation occurred. Grievances, which had numbered over 2,000 for a workforce of 4,800 before the layoffs, fell to 100 for the remaining 2,650 workers. Absenteeism dropped below 2%, a 40% improvement. Assembly time fell to 36 hours per car, a 23% improvement compared to the pre-renovation facility. This still lagged behind Japanese benchmarks of 24 to 30 hours, but the gap was narrowing. Warranty costs dropped 60%. Defects discovered during end-of-line computer inspections fell to the lowest of any GM assembly plant worldwide. The transformation was validated in 1989 when J.D. Power and Associates ranked the Buick LeSabre built at Buick City as the #1 car in North America for initial quality. Owners reported fewer than 1 problem per vehicle during the first 90 days of ownership. It was the first American-built car to top the survey, surpassing Japanese imports that had dominated for years. The 1990 model repeated the achievement. For 2 consecutive years, Buick City produced the highest quality car in North America. This was not a trivial accomplishment. J.D. Power surveys measured actual defects reported by thousands of owners, not subjective assessments or marketing claims. Buick City's success demonstrated that American workers, when given proper tools, training, and respect, could match or exceed Japanese quality standards. The achievement attracted attention. GM executives toured the facility, studying methods that could be replicated elsewhere. Automotive journalists wrote feature stories describing the turnaround. Saturn, GM's new brand designed to compete directly with Japanese imports, was explicitly modeled on Buick City's labor management partnership approach. Roger Smith, GM's chairman, called Buick City a proof of concept for the future of American manufacturing. Workers at Buick City during this period described a sense of pride that had been absent during the chaotic early years. The plant became a destination for industry delegations from around the world. Japanese executives toured the facility, surprised that American workers had successfully adapted their methods. European manufacturers sent teams to study the transformation. Business schools used Buick City as a case study in organizational change. The production floor reflected the new culture. Clean, well-lit, organized. Tools had designated locations. Parts arrived precisely when needed. Quality control stations were positioned throughout the line, catching defects immediately rather than allowing them to accumulate. Workers rotated through positions, cross-training that made them versatile and prevented the repetitive strain injuries that had plagued the old system. Team meetings occurred daily, brief gatherings where workers discussed problems encountered during the previous shift and proposed solutions. Ideas came from the floor, not from engineering offices. A worker who noticed a recurring issue with door alignment could suggest a fixture modification. If the team agreed, the change would be implemented within days. The old system would have required months of approvals through multiple management layers. Pay reflected this new approach. Workers earned base wages comparable to other GM facilities, but skill-based pay added significant premiums. A worker who mastered all 12 positions in their team area earned substantially more than one who knew only their primary job. This created incentives to learn continuously and help teammates develop skills. Senior workers became mentors rather than competitors. The physical transformation of the plant was equally dramatic. The old Buick factory had been dark, cramped, poorly ventilated. Buick City was bright, spacious, designed for efficient workflow. Materials flowed logically from receiving through fabrication to assembly. Forklifts followed designated paths marked on the floor. Elevated walkways allowed supervisors and visitors to observe production without interfering with work. The paint shop represented the most advanced technology in the complex. Robotic arms applied multiple coats with precision impossible for human painters. Computer vision systems checked coverage, flagging any missed spots or thin areas. The booth environment was controlled for temperature and humidity, ensuring consistent finishes. Workers monitored the robots, intervening when problems occurred, but the actual painting was automated. Final assembly remained labor-intensive despite robotics. Installing seats, carpets, trim, wiring harnesses, these tasks required human dexterity and judgment. Workers positioned components, secured them with specialized tools, verified correct installation. The line moved steadily, each worker performing their tasks in rhythm with their neighbors. Quality inspection at the end of the line was thorough. Each completed vehicle underwent computer diagnostics that tested every electrical system, checked for fluid leaks, verified proper operation of doors, windows, seats, and accessories. Vehicles that failed any test were pulled to a repair area where specialized technicians diagnosed and corrected problems. The goal was zero defects leaving the plant. But the success was fragile. By the mid-1990s, American consumers were abandoning sedans in favor of SUVs and light trucks. The Ford Explorer, launched in 1990, became the best-selling SUV in America. The Chevrolet Tahoe and Suburban dominated the full-size segment. Chrysler's minivans captured family buyers. Sedans, including the Buick LeSabre, were increasingly seen as outdated. Sales declined steadily, despite quality improvements. GM's strategic response prioritized SUVs and trucks, which generated higher profit margins than sedans. Full-size sedan production would be consolidated at fewer plants. Buick City, despite its quality achievements, was geographically and structurally disadvantaged. The plant was landlocked in Flint, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, with limited room for expansion. Newer facilities in Detroit and Lake Orion had more space, better logistics, and newer equipment. Then GM decided to close it anyway. The decision was announced in 1997. The official reason was declining sedan sales. Americans were shifting to SUVs and light trucks, more profitable vehicles built at newer plants. Full-size sedan production would be consolidated at Detroit Hamtramck Assembly and Lake Orion Assembly. Buick City, despite its quality achievements, was redundant. The workers at Buick City didn't believe it. UAW Local 599 argued the closure was a terrible business decision. The plant had won J.D. Power's Platinum Award for assembly plant quality in 1999. The only GM plant ever to receive it. Internal GM quality reports ranked Buick City second among 19 assembly plants. Local 599 spent $4 million on full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal and Investors Business Daily, aimed at convincing stockholders to keep Buick City open and close a different plant instead. Wall Street didn't care. Analysts focused on capacity utilization, labor costs, and capital efficiency. Buick City was an older facility in a declining market segment. Newer plants could build the same cars with less labor because they had more automation. Investment analysts also noted Flint's declining population and tax base. The city was becoming less viable as an industrial center. Infrastructure was deteriorating. The workforce was aging. GM's broader strategy was to eliminate 38,000 to 50,000 jobs across North American operations over several years. Buick City employed 1,200 workers in 1999, 1,000 full-time, 200 temporary. At peak in the mid-1980s, it had employed 28,000. Most had already been let go through attrition, early retirement buyouts, and previous layoffs. 2 strikes erupted at GM parts plants in Flint in the summer of 1998, virtually shutting down the automaker's North American operations. The strikes began at Flint Metal Center and Delphi East. Both plants produced critical components used across GM's vehicle lineup. Within days, assembly plants from Michigan to Texas ran out of parts and shut down. The strikes lasted 44 days, from June 5 to July 29, 1998. They were ostensibly about local working conditions, mandatory overtime, outsourcing, staffing levels. But the underlying issue was the wave of plant closures GM had announced. Picket lines formed at plant gates. Workers carried signs. GM, greed motors. People before profits. Flint built GM, GM abandoned Flint. UAW international leadership, however, made it clear they would not challenge GM's fundamental restructuring strategy. National union officials negotiated with GM's top executives. The focus was on securing severance packages, early retirement incentives, and transfer rights for displaced workers. Keeping plants open was not on the table. When the settlement came on July 29, 1998, it addressed the immediate grievances but did nothing to prevent closures. 1,300 of the 9,200 strikers lost their jobs in the settlement. The contract included a no-strike pledge until the 1999 national negotiations. Buick City's fate was sealed. Many workers took early retirement packages if they had sufficient seniority. GM offered incentives, lump sum payments, continued health insurance, pension bridges. Workers in their 50s with 30 years of service could retire with reasonable security. Younger workers faced harder choices. They could transfer to other GM plants, uprooting their families and leaving Flint. They could find new jobs in Flint's declining economy, or they could retrain for different careers. Transfers were difficult. GM had plants in other states, but moving meant selling houses in a market with collapsing values, leaving extended family, and starting over in unfamiliar communities. New jobs in Flint paid far less than GM wages. Service jobs, retail, food service, healthcare, paid $8 to $12 per hour, a fraction of the $25 to $35 per hour, with benefits that auto workers earned. Retraining programs offered limited help. A 50-year-old auto worker who had spent 30 years installing car doors had difficulty transitioning to computer programming or nursing. The psychological impact of the closure announcement was profound. Workers who had dedicated their adult lives to Buick City faced the erasure of their professional identities. A trim installer who had perfected his craft over decades, who could position and secure interior panels faster and more accurately than almost anyone, suddenly found those skills valueless outside the automotive industry. His expertise was specific to GM's systems, tools, and processes. Other manufacturers used different methods, different fasteners, different materials. The social fabric of the plant began unraveling during the final 2 years. Workers who had been close friends for decades grew distant, uncomfortable discussing the approaching end. Some embraced denial, convincing themselves GM would change its mind. Others became angry, bitter toward management, toward the union, toward each other. A few accepted the inevitable and focused on planning their next steps, but they were the minority. Union meetings became contentious. Older workers with sufficient seniority for retirement argued for accepting the best severance package possible and moving on. Younger workers with families and mortgages wanted the union to fight harder, to strike if necessary, to force GM to keep the plant open. The union leadership was caught between these factions, knowing that GM's decision was irreversible, but unable to say so directly without triggering a revolt. Community leaders in Flint watched helplessly. The mayor, city council, and economic development officials had no leverage over GM. They could offer tax incentives, infrastructure improvements, anything within their limited power, but GM wasn't interested. The closure decision had been made at the corporate level based on national strategy. What happened to Flint was irrelevant to that calculation. Local businesses near the plant began preparing for the economic impact. Restaurants that depended on shift change crowds knew their revenue would collapse. Bars, grocery stores, gas stations all faced the same reality. When 28,000 workers over 15 years became 1/200 and then zero, the entire commercial ecosystem would fail. Some owners tried to diversify, seeking customers from other areas of Flint. Others simply accepted they would close along with the plant. On June 29, 1999, the last vehicle rolled off the assembly line at Buick City. It was a Buick LeSabre, dark green, fully equipped. Workers gathered around it as it moved down the line, each station performing its task for the final time. When the car reached the end of the line, workers signed it with marker pens. Names, dates, messages. Last one out, turn off the lights. Flint built America. We'll remember. Then workers shut down the machinery, turned off the lights, and left. One of approximately 16 million Buicks built in Flint since 1904. The final one. The line stopped. The machines went silent. The ceremonial aspect of that final shift couldn't disguise the grief. Men and women who had worked together for decades, who had celebrated births and mourned deaths, who had seen each other through divorces and illnesses and financial crises, said goodbye knowing they would likely never see each other again. The plant had been the center of their social world. Without it, those connections would fade. Some workers brought cameras to document the final hours. They photographed their workstations, their tools, their teammates. They walked through buildings they had entered thousands of times, trying to memorize details they knew would soon be erased. The physical space held decades of memories. Injuries survived, production records broken, friendships formed, conflicts resolved. The last LeSabre that rolled off the line was driven to a special area where GM officials prepared it for transport to a museum. It would be preserved as a historical artifact, a memorial to Buick's presence in Flint. The workers who built it would not be similarly preserved. They would scatter, finding other work or retiring, becoming statistics in economic reports about manufacturing decline. Production equipment was dismantled and shipped to other facilities. The northern section of the complex, renamed GM Powertrain Flint North, continued manufacturing engines and components for another decade, employing a fraction of the original workforce. The assembly plant buildings were vacated. By 2002, demolition began. 24 buildings that had stood for nearly a century were torn down. Brick, steel, concrete, and glass were hauled away. The elevated bridges disappeared. The internal rail lines were ripped up. The demolition process was methodical and impersonal. Contractors arrived with heavy equipment and began systematic destruction. Buildings that had housed thousands of workers, that had produced millions of vehicles, were reduced to rubble in weeks. Dust clouds rose over Flint as wrecking balls swung and excavators clawed at structural steel. Neighbors watched from their homes, witnessing the physical erasure of the industry that had defined their city for a century. Environmental concerns complicated demolition. Lead paint, asbestos insulation, PCB containing electrical equipment all required special handling. Contractors segregated hazardous materials for proper disposal, but the soil beneath the buildings was already contaminated from decades of industrial processes. That contamination would remain long after the structures were gone. By 2010, GM Powertrain Flint North also closed. On December 6, 2010, GM vacated the entire property and transferred site responsibilities to Motors Liquidation Company, the entity created to handle assets from GM's 2009 bankruptcy. The 413-acre site sat empty. Fences surrounded the property. Security guards patrolled to prevent trespassing and vandalism, but there was little left to protect. The buildings were gone. The equipment was gone. Only contaminated land remained. Flint had already been in decline for decades, but the loss of Buick City accelerated the collapse. GM employment in the Flint area fell from 77,000 in 1978 to 33,000 by 1999. The official unemployment rate in Flint reached 9.7% by 1999, more than double the state average. Flint's population fell from 196,140 in 1960 to 102,434 in 2010, a loss of nearly half. By 2020, the population was 81,109, the lowest since 1910. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Houses sat vacant, then were stripped for copper and appliances, then collapsed from neglect. The tax base evaporated. The city couldn't maintain infrastructure. Water mains broke. Roads crumbled. Streetlights went dark. The connection between the closure of Buick City and the water crisis that would poison Flint's children was infrastructure decay. As population fell and tax revenue disappeared, the city's water system, built to serve 200,000 residents and industrial facilities using millions of gallons daily, became oversized and expensive to maintain. By 2011, when the state put Flint under emergency management, the infrastructure was in a death spiral. In 2013, emergency managers appointed by Michigan Governor Rick Snyder made a decision to save money. Flint had been buying treated water from Detroit, which drew from Lake Huron. The contract was expensive. The managers decided to switch Flint's water source to the Flint River, while a new pipeline to Lake Huron was being constructed. The Flint River was highly corrosive. Proper treatment required specific chemicals to prevent the water from leaching lead from aging pipes. State environmental officials told city water treatment staff that corrosion control treatment would not be necessary for a year. That decision led directly to the lead contamination crisis. On April 25, 2014, Flint began drawing water from the Flint River. Within months, residents noticed the water smelled foul, tasted bad, and was discolored. Complaints mounted. People reported skin rashes, hair loss, and illnesses. Government officials repeatedly dismissed the concerns. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality tested water at the treatment plant, not in homes where lead was leaching from pipes. Results showed the water was safe. Officials told residents their concerns were unfounded. In October 2014, a GM factory in Flint switched from Flint River water to Lake Huron water because the engines being built were beginning to rust. Concern for metal car components prompted immediate action. Concern for children did not. Doctors began noticing elevated lead levels in children's blood tests. Leanne Walters, a Flint resident, had her water tested independently. Results showed dangerous lead levels. She contacted researchers at Virginia Tech. They conducted broader testing and found lead contamination throughout the city. Simultaneously, Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha, a pediatrician at Hurley Medical Center, analyzed county health data and found that the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels had doubled and in some neighborhoods tripled since the water source switch. The state denied the findings. Officials attempted to discredit the research, but the evidence was overwhelming. By October 2015, the state acknowledged the problem. Flint returned to Detroit water, but the damage was done. Lead exposure is irreversible. Children who absorbed lead from the water would carry the neurological and developmental effects for life. Estimates suggested between 6,000 and 12,000 children were exposed. The crisis also included an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. From June 2014 to November 2015, 87 cases were reported in Genesee County, resulting in 12 deaths. The contaminated water system was the suspected cause. The Flint water crisis became a national scandal. It exposed systemic failures at local, state, and federal levels. Emergency managers appointed by the state prioritized cost savings over public health. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission concluded the governmental response was a result of systemic racism. The crisis would not have been allowed to persist in wealthier, whiter Michigan cities. Investigations led to criminal charges. Multiple state officials were convicted of misconduct, willful neglect of duty, and other offenses. Settlements totaling $626 million were approved to compensate residents, with 80% designated for children affected by lead exposure. The city began replacing every lead pipe in the system, a process that took years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But Flint's problems were compounded by another form of contamination, this one directly linked to the Buick City site. In 2018, testing revealed PFAS contamination in groundwater and sewers around the former Buick City property. PFAS are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, synthetic chemicals known as forever chemicals, because they persist in the environment indefinitely. They were used in firefighting foam, metal plating, and industrial painting operations, all activities that occurred at Buick City for decades. PFAS chemicals were developed in the 1940s and became widely used in industrial and consumer products because of their unique properties. They repel water, oil, and stains. They withstand extreme temperatures. They don't break down easily. These properties made them ideal for firefighting foam used to extinguish petroleum fires, for metal plating operations that required chemical resistance, and for industrial coatings that protected surfaces from corrosion. The problem is that the same properties that make PFAS useful also make them dangerous. They don't break down in the environment or in human bodies. They accumulate over time. Exposure comes from drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated fish, breathing contaminated air, or touching contaminated soil. Once in the body, PFAS accumulate in blood, liver, and kidneys. They're linked to cancers, liver damage, immune system problems, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, pregnancy complications, and developmental issues in children. Workers at Buick City were exposed to PFAS for decades without knowing it. Firefighting training exercises used foam containing PFOS and PFOA, two of the most toxic PFAS compounds. Trainers sprayed foam on simulated fires in designated areas. The foam soaked into soil and groundwater. Over decades, concentrations built up. Metal plating operations also used PFAS-containing chemicals. Chrome plating, a common process for automotive parts, required baths of chromic acid and other chemicals. Some formulations contained PFAS to improve adhesion and durability. Workers handled these chemicals daily, often with minimal protective equipment by modern standards. Painting operations presented additional risks. Industrial paints in the mid-20th century often contained PFAS to improve durability and water resistance. Spray painting released aerosolized particles that workers inhaled. Waste paint and solvents were disposed of on-site in lagoons or buried in landfills, leaching into groundwater over time. The full extent of PFAS use at Buick City is unknown. Environmental regulations in the 1950s through 1980s were minimal. Companies weren't required to track chemical use comprehensively. Record-keeping was inconsistent. When Buick City closed and buildings were demolished, documentation was lost or discarded. What remains are chemical signatures in soil and groundwater, evidence of past practices that were legal at the time but are now understood to be dangerous. In April 2018, Racer Trust, the entity responsible for managing and cleaning former GM properties, sampled groundwater near the former firefighting training area at Buick City. 3 of 8 monitoring wells showed PFAS levels above 70 parts per trillion. In August 2018, additional samples were collected near the former wastewater treatment plant, near historic painting operations, and near plating areas. Results showed contamination far exceeding initial estimates. The firefighting training area measured up to 600 parts per trillion for total PFAS compounds. The wastewater treatment plant area measured 4,800 parts per trillion. Near historic painting and enameling operations south of Leith Street, levels reached 4,600 parts per trillion. The Building 44 paint shop on Hamilton showed 15,000 parts per trillion, the highest reading on the site. These numbers are significant. Michigan's cleanup standard for surface water is 12 parts per trillion. The paint shop area was more than 1/200 times above the standard. The contamination was not isolated or minor. It was pervasive and severe. On August 13, 2018, the city of Flint tested sanitary sewer lines draining from the Buick City area into the municipal system. One sewer line showed PFOS levels of 720 parts per trillion, 60 times above Michigan's surface water standard. The contamination was mobile, moving through groundwater into sewers and potentially into the Flint River. Racer Trust responded by installing plugs in sewer laterals to prevent contaminated groundwater from infiltrating the sewer system. Bulkheads were constructed at specific outfalls. Storm sewers were rerouted to prevent PFAS from reaching the Flint River. Monitoring wells were drilled across the 413-acre site to map contamination plumes and track movement. The work is ongoing and will continue for decades. PFAS remediation is complicated because the chemicals don't break down naturally. Options include excavating contaminated soil and transporting it to specialized landfills, pumping contaminated groundwater and treating it with activated carbon filters that absorb PFAS, or capping contaminated areas with impermeable barriers to prevent chemicals from spreading. Each approach has limitations. No perfect solution exists. The health implications for workers and residents are uncertain. Epidemiological studies on PFAS exposure are relatively recent. Long-term effects may not appear for decades. Auto workers who retired in the 1990s after 30 years at Buick City have high cumulative exposure. If they develop cancers, liver disease, or immune system problems in the 2020s or 2030s, connecting those illnesses to workplace exposure will be difficult. Proving causation requires showing that exposure levels were sufficient and that other factors didn't cause the illness. The data often doesn't exist. Community members living near Buick City also face risks. Private wells in the area are not used for drinking water. Flint's municipal system supplies all households, but historical use of wells for drinking, irrigation, or other purposes may have resulted in exposure before contamination was discovered. Fish in the Flint River accumulate PFAS in their tissues. Eating those fish introduces PFAS into the body. A fish consumption advisory is in place, but compliance depends on awareness and voluntary behavior. Children are particularly vulnerable. PFAS exposure during pregnancy or early childhood can affect brain development, immune function, and growth. Effects may not become apparent until adolescence or adulthood. The lead crisis in Flint's drinking water already damaged one generation of children. PFAS contamination near former industrial sites represents another long-term threat. slower and less visible, but potentially equally harmful. The discovery of PFAS at Buick City came during the peak of public attention on the Flint water crisis. The juxtaposition was powerful. Flint's children were being poisoned by lead in drinking water, while the ground beneath the city's most important industrial site was poisoned by chemicals that wouldn't degrade for centuries. Both crises resulted from prioritizing short-term costs over long-term consequences. Both demonstrated that some communities are considered expendable. In 2023, Michigan officials broke ground on the Flint Commerce Center, a $300 million redevelopment project planned for the Buick City site. The project envisions 10 buildings totaling 3.5 million square feet of warehouse and light industrial space, potentially providing 3,000 jobs. American Cast Iron Pipe Company announced plans to build a 200,000 square foot manufacturing plant on a portion of the site. Lear Corporation opened a 156,000 square foot seat manufacturing facility in 2018, employing hundreds. The redevelopment is the largest brownfield project in American history, an attempt to reclaim contaminated industrial land and transform it into productive use. Cleanup is ongoing. PFAS remediation is complicated and expensive. Lead, petroleum products, heavy metals, and other contaminants remain in soil and groundwater across much of the property. Full remediation will take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Flint Mayor Sheldon Neely called the redevelopment a lighthouse of hope for the northern portions of our city down the poverty corridor of Genesee County. Whether that hope materializes depends on whether the jobs return, whether the wages are sufficient, whether the contamination is fully addressed. But even if the redevelopment succeeds, it will employ a fraction of the workforce that Buick City once did. The 3,000 potential jobs represent 10% of the 30,000 who worked there at peak. The new jobs are warehouse and light assembly work, not skilled manufacturing. The wages will be lower. The benefits will be less generous. The promise that drove generations, that hard work in a factory could support a family, buy a house, send kids to college, no longer holds. Flint's population remains under 82,000, less than half its 1960 peak. The city ranks among the most dangerous in the United States by crime statistics. Poverty rates are among the highest in Michigan. The median household income is $28,834, far below state and national averages. 57% of residents live below or near the poverty line. The water crisis has been addressed in the sense that the acute emergency ended. Lead pipes have been replaced, filters were distributed, water quality monitoring is more rigorous, but trust remains broken. Many residents still refuse to drink tap water, relying instead on bottled water. The neurological damage to children exposed to lead is permanent. The full consequences won't be understood for decades. What remains of Buick City today is mostly absence. The buildings are gone. The machines are gone. The noise is gone. The 413 acres sit largely vacant, waiting for redevelopment that may or may not fully materialize. A few new structures have risen on portions of the site, but they are disconnected from the original purpose. The site that once built cars from raw materials to finished product is now fragmented and deindustrialized. The people who built cars at Buick City did not lack skill or effort. The 1989 and 1990 Le Sabres were the highest quality cars in North America by independent measurement. The workers achieved that by solving problems, learning new methods, and committing to excellence. They proved that American manufacturing could compete with anyone in the world. Then GM closed the plant anyway, because the numbers said it was redundant. The decision to close Buick City was rational by the logic of corporate efficiency. Consolidating production at fewer plants reduces overhead. Newer facilities have better layouts and equipment. Full-size sedans were declining in sales while SUVs were growing. GM needed to cut costs. Flint was expendable. For individual workers, the closure meant the end of careers, the disruption of identities, and often the destruction of financial security. A 55-year-old worker with 35 years of seniority had defined his adult life by his job at Buick City. When the plant closed, that worker faced impossible choices. He could accept a transfer to a GM plant in another state, leaving his home of 35 years, selling his house in a collapsed market, starting over in a place where he knew nobody. Or he could stay in Flint, take early retirement with a reduced pension, and watch his savings slowly erode. Or he could find another job, likely at a fraction of his GM wages. The families of Buick City workers absorbed the shock in different ways. Spouses who had built lives around the factory's rhythms, planning dinners around shift schedules, organizing social activities with other auto worker families, budgeting based on predictable GM paychecks, suddenly faced uncertainty. Children who had assumed they would follow parents into the plant continuing multi-generational traditions had to reconsider their futures. Some families weathered the transition successfully. Workers with marketable skills found comparable employment. Those with significant seniority retired comfortably. A few even thrived, using buyout packages to start small businesses or pursue long-deferred dreams. But these were exceptions. Most families experienced significant downward mobility. The social costs were harder to quantify than the economic ones. Depression rates among displaced auto workers increased. Substance abuse became more common. Domestic violence incidents rose. Divorce rates climbed. These were predictable consequences of sudden economic dislocation combined with loss of identity and purpose. Neighborhoods built around Buick City declined rapidly. The houses near the plant had been owner-occupied by auto workers earning middle-class wages. When the workers left, the houses emptied. Some were sold at a loss. Some were abandoned to foreclosure. Property values collapsed. A house worth $80,000 in 1995 might sell for $20,000 in 2000. If it sold at all. Owners who stayed found themselves trapped in neighborhoods of vacant homes, their primary asset worthless. The tax base disappeared. Flint's revenue came primarily from property taxes on residential and industrial property. When population declined and property values collapsed, tax revenue declined proportionally. The city couldn't maintain services. Police and fire departments shrank. Road repairs stopped. Streetlights went dark. Parks became overgrown. Schools consolidated and closed. The spiral accelerated. Declining services pushed more residents to leave, further reducing revenue, forcing more service cuts. Flint's experience is not unique. Across the Rust Belt, similar stories unfolded in cities built around single industries. Youngstown, Gary, Detroit, Akron, Bethlehem, each lost the factories that defined them, then struggled with the aftermath. Population decline, infrastructure failure, poverty, and contamination followed similar patterns. The differences were in scale and visibility. Flint's water crisis brought national attention. Other cities suffered in obscurity. The contamination at Buick City, both the PFAS and the broader environmental damage, represents a particular kind of legacy. For a century, the site produced cars. The processes used to build those cars generated waste that was disposed of with little oversight. None of this was illegal at the time. Environmental regulations were minimal or non-existent. The priority was production. Now the costs are being reckoned. The irony is that Buick City succeeded at what it was designed to do. It built cars efficiently and, in its final years, at world-class quality. The workers did their jobs. The engineers solved problems. The managers implemented new methods. The facility won awards. None of that mattered when the decision came to close it. Success didn't protect the plant or the workers or the city. The broader question is, what was lost when Buick City closed? The immediate loss was 28,000 jobs over 15 years. The secondary loss was the economic multiplier. Every auto worker supported service jobs in the community. When those wages disappeared, the entire ecosystem collapsed. But there was also a loss of capacity. Buick City could build cars at scale with quality that rivaled anyone. That capability is gone. The buildings are demolished. The equipment is dispersed. The workforce is retired, dead, or working other jobs. Recreating it would require rebuilding from scratch. The loss of capacity is national, not just local. Every closed factory represents a reduction in American manufacturing capability. The skills, infrastructure, and supply chains don't simply pause. They dissolve. When manufacturing moves offshore, it's not easily brought back. The ecosystem that supported domestic production, suppliers, skilled workers, specialized equipment manufacturers, fragments and diminishes. Flint's current attempts at redevelopment are focused on logistics rather than manufacturing. Warehouses store products made elsewhere. Distribution centers move goods made elsewhere. The new jobs are lower skilled and lower paid than the manufacturing jobs they replace. The workers at the Lear Corporation facility build seats, but the seats are installed in cars assembled in other states or other countries. The value chain is fragmented. The economic benefit is diffused. The PFAS contamination complicates redevelopment. Investors are wary of environmental liabilities. Even with Racer Trust handling cleanup, uncertainty about long-term contamination affects property values and insurance costs. The stigma of a contaminated site persists even after remediation. Flint must compete for investment with locations that don't carry that baggage. The story of Buick City intersects with the story of William Durant's final years in ways that echo across generations. Durant built GM with borrowed money and outsized ambition. He lost control twice because he expanded faster than revenue could support. He died running a bowling alley across the street from the factory that had made him a legend. David Buick's fate was similar. He invented the engine that powered millions of cars. He sold his stock for immediate cash and watched others become wealthy from his creation. Both men were visionaries who couldn't monetize their visions. They built industries and were discarded by those industries. The pattern repeated at Buick City. The workers built world-class cars and were discarded when those cars became redundant. The city provided land, infrastructure, and workers, and was discarded when the company moved on. The mechanism is the same at every scale. Value is extracted, and the source of that value is abandoned when extraction is no longer profitable. The contamination at Buick City is a physical manifestation of that extraction. The chemicals in the groundwater are residue from a century of production. The PFAS, the lead, the petroleum, all are byproducts of building cars. The products left, the waste remained. Cleanup costs are socialized, while profits were privatized. GM paid into Racer Trust as part of its bankruptcy, but the amount is a fraction of the long-term cost. Michigan taxpayers and federal programs will cover much of the remainder. The people who live in Flint will live with the consequences. The water crisis adds another layer. The decision to switch to Flint River water was made by state-appointed emergency managers, not by elected city officials. Flint residents had no vote. The decision prioritized cost savings over safety. When residents complained, officials dismissed them. When doctors and scientists proved lead contamination, the state tried to discredit them. The crisis revealed that some communities are considered expendable by those in power. Flint is majority black and majority poor. The water crisis would not have been allowed to persist in wealthier, whiter communities. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission stated this explicitly. The inadequate governmental response was a result of systemic racism. Treating Flint the same as other communities while ignoring its specific vulnerabilities produced inequitable outcomes. The same dynamic applied to the closure of Buick City. GM could close the Flint plant because the workers were replaceable, the city was powerless, and the state was indifferent. Wealthier communities with political influence can attract and retain industrial investment. Poor communities cannot. When Buick City closed, Flint had no leverage to stop it. UAW Local 599 spent millions on ads pleading for the plant to stay open. Wall Street didn't care. GM didn't care. The plant closed. Flint's experience forces confrontation with the question of what communities are owed by the industries that built them. For a century, Flint provided land, workers, infrastructure, and political support to GM. Generations of families dedicated their lives to building Buicks. When GM decided the plant was redundant, it closed it and walked away. The contamination, the unemployment, the collapsing infrastructure, these became Flint's problems, not GM's. There is no obvious solution. Corporations operate by different logic than communities. GM's responsibility is to shareholders, not to Flint. Keeping an inefficient plant open for social reasons contradicts the purpose of a corporation. But allowing corporations to extract value from communities and abandon them when profitability declines creates wastelands. Flint is one of many. The attempts at redevelopment represent hope, but also resignation. Flint is not waiting for GM to return. The city is trying to repurpose contaminated industrial land for logistics and light manufacturing. The scale is smaller, the wages are lower, the prospects are uncertain, but it's what's available. The alternative is abandonment. The water crisis has become Flint's defining narrative, overshadowing the longer history of deindustrialization that created the conditions for the crisis. Lead in the water is acute and visible. The loss of 120,000 residents and 70,000 jobs over 60 years is chronic and diffuse. Both are devastating. The lead crisis affected thousands of children directly. The economic collapse affected tens of thousands of families across generations. Policy responses have focused on the water. Lead pipes were replaced. Monitoring increased. Compensation funds were established. These are necessary, but they don't address the underlying issue. Flint is a city built for 200,000 people that now has 80,000. The infrastructure is too large, too expensive, too old. The tax base is too small. The jobs are gone. Fixing the pipes doesn't fix that. The PFAS contamination at Buick City is being addressed through remediation, but the timeline is measured in decades. PFAS doesn't break down. It must be physically removed or contained. Groundwater will require monitoring for generations. Workers who spent decades at Buick City breathing air contaminated with volatile organic compounds, working near plating chemicals, washing with water containing PFAS. Their exposure is cumulative and irreversible. The health effects may not appear for decades. What Buick City represents ultimately is the gap between what American industry promised and what it delivered. The promise was prosperity, stability, and community. Work hard, build a good product, and you'll be rewarded with a middle-class life. For many decades, that promise held. Workers at Buick City earned good wages, had strong benefits, bought houses, sent kids to college. The factory was the center of a functional ecosystem. But the promise was conditional. It depended on the factory remaining profitable and on the company choosing to keep the factory open. When conditions changed, foreign competition, shifting consumer preferences, corporate restructuring, the promise was revoked. The workers who had built their lives around Buick City had no fallback. The skills that made them valuable in an automotive plant didn't transfer to other industries. Seniority and pension years didn't transfer. They could relocate to other GM plants, abandoning their community, or they could stay in Flint and find lower-wage work. The workers at Buick City who stayed through the final years, the ones who transformed the plant into the highest quality facility in North America, believed they were saving their jobs. They learned new skills. They embraced Japanese manufacturing methods. They worked with management to solve problems. They proved they could compete with anyone. And then the plant closed anyway. Quality didn't matter. Commitment didn't matter. The decision was made by people who never set foot on the factory floor. That's the cruelest aspect of Buick City's closure. It didn't fail. It succeeded. It won awards. It produced the best cars in North America. Success was not enough. The workers who built the final LeSabre on June 29, 1999, knew they were part of something ending. Nearly 16 million Buicks had been built in Flint over 95 years. That LeSabre was the last. Now the site where men and women built cars for a century is dirt and grass, fenced off, contaminated, waiting. The ground where workers once stood building cars is now poisoned with chemicals that will persist for centuries. This is what legacy looks like when profit moves on and people stay behind.